I am the Vampire Lestat. Remember me? The Queen of the Damned is the third book in the Anne Rice Vampire Chronicles series and forms the basis of their lore and history of vampire kind for this series. So there is a lot of information, okay? And many characters that are introduced are done so either by having their own sections or by being in someone else's section. So I won't be able to go over every single character as much as I would like to. Perhaps I'll do like a separate video at some point talking about it, but as it stands, this is going to be a long video as it is, that contains a whole bunch of characters and a massive beast of a plot. So, grab your vampire blood and settle in for the long haul. Or you can press pause every now and again and take a break. Unlike the first two books, Interview of the Vampire and The Vampire Lestat, which are autobiographical works focused on two people, Louis and Lestat, Queen of the Damned has autobiographical parts from Lestat's perspective, yet contain many sections that focus on new and old characters alike, told in third-person perspective. I'll begin with summarizing the plot, which has several aspects interwoven within it. The main crux of that is Lestat de Lincourt is a vampire who becomes an international rock star, and with his exposure, his brazen lyrics, which he explains what he is and that there are others like him, he's making other vampires nervous. He is doing the forbidden. Okay, he names other immortals and gives away vampire secrets, and while the audience, us, isn't in on the joke, Lestat and the other vampires are. And so a plot is concocted to kill him after the big concert, his one and only concert in California, get him alone, out of sight of the immortals, hack him to pieces, and then destroy the pieces. But there's a kink in that plan in the form of an ancient being, Akasha, the Queen of the Damned. She is the mother of all vampires, and Lestat has awoken her from thousands of years of sleep with his music, which includes talking about her, at least in part, since he had met her beforehand, briefly. And she's decided to kill her equally ancient but silent partner and go and seek Lestat out to be her new consort. She destroys vampires young and old, finding them in their crypts and in the crowded coven houses, okay, leaving only a few vampires alive, which mostly consist of people Lestat loved and some people that those people loved. She isn't just doing this for Lestat, however. She's doing this so she can wipe the slate clean and erase some evil from the world, and basically have little to no competition when she begins ruling over humanity as a goddess. See, Akasha in her slumber actually was able to travel outside of her body, and for centuries she's seen the world torn apart by hunger and by war, so many little injustices every single day, that she attributed all to men. Men, in her mind, are the root of all evil, and she believes wholly that if she eliminates most men from the planet and rules benevolently over the women, the world will be at peace at last. That, and she thinks that vampires are evil by their sheer existence, given that A, they were an accident that never should have occurred, and B, haven't even attempted to use their supernatural powers to their full potential for the betterment of the world. Though she wants to use all of her powers to enact a bunch of bloodshed and then rule over the other people through violence and mind control. She uses mind control to get the women to slaughter the men, including their babies, in mass. She starts with smaller third world countries that she doesn't name, okay? She names dozens of places that they could be, but never gives Lestat an answer as to where they actually are, making the point that there are so many different countries, like the ones that they're in, that it doesn't matter where they are, it's just the fact that any of this suffering exists at all. She also manipulates Lestat into using his new powers she's given him via blood sharing, a somewhat romantic and sexual act for vampires, and he too starts slaughtering men left and right in her name. And he does feel awful about it. He does try to convince her several times that her plan isn't right. He doesn't just like killing people for the sheer pleasure of doing so, even if it's for some greater good cause. You know, misguided as it is. Though there are times where he admits he does actually enjoy it, okay? While he has toyed with the idea of a war between mortals and vampires, he doesn't actually think it would come to be, and Lestat, for the most part, does strive for some level of goodness, even as a monster, and usually only targets evil people. Funny enough, I actually wrote something about how I don't view Lestat as, like, a hero, how I've always viewed him as kind of villainous, on my Tumblr at one point. Maybe I'll actually include that in a character video for this, if I get a second part. You know, he mainly targets, like, drug lords, murderers, you get the gist, okay? Lestat is a likable monster. You know, none of this wanton destruction of people, you know? Just, carefully targeted stalking is what he usually prefers. Well, she is having none of it, okay? She wants Lestat to be her avenging prince, to keep those pesky mortals in line, and she wants the few remaining vampires to be basically her angels, okay? The other vampires, however, while acknowledging that they are accidents and are evil by virtue of their existence, since they do kill every single night to survive, they do also have a sense of goodness, the greater goodness. This is in part brought on by Mahoret's Great Family, which I will explain more fully when I go over characters, but the Great Family is this massive ancient family that spans over all of the globe, and it started with Mahoret. So through that and their own personal views, they see their ties to humanity, and by extension, their needing to distance themselves from humanity all in one go. They shouldn't seek to destroy and control them, but to leave them to their own means, which means that they will never side with Akasha, who wants to just tear them apart and then subjugate them. By that point, Akasha is just set on destroying them too, and no one can stop her because she's just so old and powerful, and, you know, aside from someone as old and as powerful as she is, and in comes Makare, who is Mahoret's twin sister. Makare charges in, smashes Akasha through a massive glass window which severs her head from her body, and together with Mahoret, they consume her brain and heart, which is symbolic of what had transpired many moons ago, which is going to take even more time to explain. Alright, so throughout the entire story, we're told about the twins. It is a legend of two red-haired women who lived sometime, you know, whenever. They don't know because these drawings and paintings and sketches are found, like, all over the world in obscure places, okay? But they lived sometime in Africa before Egypt was a massive kingdom, before mummification was even a practice. They lived in very simple houses, and no pyramids were grouped together to attract tourists centuries later. This was really fucking old times, okay? The only writing available was cuneiform, and even with that, it was very rarely seen. The people in this land had ancient religions and customs that included the consumption of their loved ones' remains after they had died, so as not to disrespect their memory by leaving them in the earth to rot. And you also take something of them into yourself. And it's painted as this genuinely loving act, and it is the right and duty of the living members of the family to do so. Okay, and Mahoret and Makare were these twins. They were witches, they were powerful, they spoke to spirits, and they were targeted by Queen Akasha and King Enkiel of how we think of Egypt because of their cannibalism and their witchcraft, which they were curious about. See, Akasha hated cannibalism, okay? She was this foreign queen who had married into another ruling class family in a different country, you know, Egypt, and she couldn't stomach the notion of people eating dead people, not understanding the meaning behind the action, nor caring. And she ordered the execution of any cannibal that didn't change their ways, or didn't even offer them the chance to change before just slaughtering them. Okay? Which is what she had ordered for Maharet and Makari's village, and then had them left alive so she could see for herself their powers. Fun fact, because she hated cannibalism so much, yet had to find a way to appease the superstitious people she had come to rule over, she and Ankiel helped foster a mythology of a life after death that required the preservation of the body, which became mummification. Yeah, they started mummification to stop people from eating their dead, but still feel like they were being loving and respectful to their dead. So basically this was fucking awful, okay? The soldiers led by Ankiel killed all of these peaceful villagers and desecrated the feast of their mother. You see, Maharet and Makari's mother had died, and they set up this huge altar, cooked her body, separated her heart on one plate and her brain onto another, and were about to start this very important ritual when the soldiers attacked, stamping all over the body and the organs, and slaughtering all of their people in front of them, leaving only them alive. That fucked them up. There is description of grief and sorrow in them. Okay? The twins were carted off and taken to Egypt, and before the queen especially, who was the most curious about them, had to communicate with spirits and give answers to spiritually based questions. Okay? And this happened in stages, but at one point it seemed to be going fairly well, yet there was this bad, egotistical spirit named Amel that followed Maharet and Makari all the way from their ruined home to the court of the queen and king, insisting that not only could he help, that he wanted to help, and the witches were stupid for not trusting him. It was mainly for his own benefit, as spirits in this book mainly like attention and showing off. They like lots of praise and worship, and they pretend to be gods in people's temples, but ultimately spirits are just flighty things that have no real concept of what it means to be flesh-bound, even though that they would like to, and they have no understanding of how societies and manners and things work. They genuinely don't. And he is especially troublesome because he's quite powerful and impressive, and he can draw blood and claims to like the taste of it, which makes Akasha especially worried. With Amel on the witch's side, Akasha is just too scared to kill them outright, afraid of being attacked again by Amel, who had scratched her up and brought to her a necklace that belonged to a dead and buried member of her family to try to show off. But yet it actually horrified her because there is no fucking way that that necklace should have ever been found, okay? It's actually quite a devastating thing for her. So she basically humiliates and hurts the witches by telling them that they will be raped in front of the court to show that they have no powers and are not worthy of fear and respect, and if they call upon Amel or any other spirit for help, they will instantly be killed. Okay, so from there, Maharet gets pregnant by Cayman, okay, the king and queen's right-hand man, who was in charge of this rape punishment, which is pretty fucked up, especially because during their time traveling to and being in Egypt, Cayman had become a friend of sorts to them. But they are allowed to return home afterwards, where they find this new crop of people has settled into their area, and they have this one blissful, pure year, okay, living there, before the army comes again, led by Cayman this time, who is quite fucking distraught. So Maharet has this daughter, and she drops her off with some of the women of their new village, and she and her sister go back to Egypt to figure out what has become of the king and queen. See, a spirit has attacked in retaliation for what had happened to them, okay? First it attacked Cayman, okay, because he was directly responsible for, you know, the action, and when the spirit made the rotting corpse of his father dance and slam against his door, okay, he got so upset and went to see his king and queen for help, who eventually decided to face it, see if they could negotiate with it, and drive it from Cayman's house. Well, there were these loyalists to the old cannibalistic religion, and didn't agree with the treatment of the witches in the first place and decided that they were going to kill Akasha and Inkiel, and they wait until they're inside the house with the spirit and they stab them to death, okay? However, the spirit enters their wounds and resurrects them. From then on, they cannot go into the sunlight, they need to drink blood, sometimes several people a night. They can read minds, they have strength unparalleled to humans, okay? And they both love and hate this new state, but mostly want to understand it so they can best control and utilize it. Turns out, this spirit was Amel, and Makare is the one who had sent him to torment those that had hurt them. Okay, she couldn't have accounted for the extent in which this would have happened. Could never in a million years fathom a spirit forming a bond with a fleshy being. Spirits do not have flesh, and while they can possess, okay, if they're powerful enough, they never actually have fused with an earthly creature, okay? A vampire never had existed until that very moment when the king and queen were resurrected. And they can't change it. The witches have no answers. They can't do anything, okay? And in the queen's mind, it is their fault. It isn't really. Maharet had no idea that this was going on, and Makare only wanted to mess with them out of revenge for the countless things that they had done to hurt them. So they are ordered to die the next day. Maharet has her eyes cut out, and Makare has her tongue cut out, and they are left to suffer in their cell. And they are visited by Cayman, who had been turned into a vampire by his queen against his will. Angry at himself for being complacent in the twins' treatment, his betrayal of his old religion, and with the now tyrannical rule of the newly powerful queen and king, he gives the twins the blood, and they become vampires. Now, being unsure of whether they will be destroyed if one of their fledglings is, vampires, again, are very, very new, and they actually take Maharet and Makare and lock them into stone coffins and set them adrift on rafts on opposite sides of the world where they are never to meet again until the 1980s after Lestat's big-ass concert, where the surviving vampires gather in Maharet's home to await the queen's arrival, knowing that they can't outrun her. God damn, that was a lot. In the book, these stories are interwoven and given in parts, at least to add some intrigue into the inner workings of these beings. Okay, the tale of the twins is teased through dreams that most vampires are having, where they see part of what is going on, but they don't know the whole story. And most die in ignorance. They never learn what this story actually means. They only see, like, a couple of instances where the twins are being attacked. The only reason we get to know what the story is Maharet herself tells the survivors when they join her in her home over the course of a couple of nights. And I don't mind that. It creates several layers of theme and depth in the work that helps flesh things out, yet doesn't play its hand too soon. It helps keep you curious. Admittingly, sometimes it drags on a bit, but I like that there were these big earth-shattering events that tied all of these individual characters together. It is just fascinating to see what everyone's individual responses are to the same situation. Characters! There are a whole bunch of characters, so I'm going to start with some new ones and then go into some older ones. Again, I'm not going over everybody, I'm just picking and choosing some of my personal favorites or ones that I think are very relevant to the story. Maharet and Makare. As mentioned before, these twins were witches in very ancient times, and eventually were a part of the First Brood, which is the group of the very, very first vampires to have ever existed. So, when Maharet eventually was freed from her stone coffin, she went back and found her daughter, and from there she presided over the descendants of that daughter across every continent, across time, and at some point she decided that she wanted to be active in this family in some way, okay? So she chose to be Aunt Maharet, which she built around herself this sort of lore within what they called the Great Family. She was a woman that always was in contact with every single branch, maintained records, and what started as her name became a title. Supposedly, one female relative of one part of the family would take over the title of Maharet. And through the centuries, this is what kept her sane. She was the benevolent overseer of her family, watched it grow, took care of them in times of need. She is elegant, strong-willed, forceful, independent. And at one point, she finds the statues of the king and queen. They had gone... Cayman had led a huge revolt against them, trapped them, and continuously drained their blood until eventually they lost the will to live but couldn't die, and they became these living statues. They have not moved in thousands of years. And she looks at their still faces, and specifically to Akasha, who is the main driving force for her and her sister's misery, tells her that she's lost. Her family lives, she herself is successful, and Akasha ultimately is useless, irrelevant, and has lost. Makare, however, went insane. She never found her sister, she never had that family to keep her going and to focus on, and from what we can gather, she just wanders. So the only thing that kept her motivated was to live long enough to kill Queen Akasha, who, more so than the king, was the cause of her and her sister's suffering. She vows before her tongue is cut out to deliver retribution upon the queen with her own 2 hands. And centuries later, she does. She is the one that is powerful enough to kill Akasha. She does it, and then she eats her brain. Tied to these 2 characters is Jessie. She is a very distant relation of Mahoret's and is human. We get a human character, and she's interesting. She's goal-oriented, she's curious, and she's independent. She's educated and can communicate with spirits. She has a degree in archaeology, and due to this and her powers, she is a good candidate to work for the supernatural archive group, the Talamasca, who observe witches, spirits, and so forth, while gathering information and helping those in need. Unfortunately, they are a very secret organization, so no one will ever be privy to the fruits of their labor. What the fuck is the point of that? I mean, they make it clear, even in the book, it's kind of silly that most of what they're researching will only be available to a select group of people. But Jessie nonetheless finds this rewarding for her own self. She is never to want for anything with the Talamasca because they are quite wealthy and they take care of their own, to the point where most of the members die in the mother house at old age. She finds meaning in the work she does because not everyone can do it, and she feels included in something bigger than herself. This is especially meaningful because she was rejected by Mahoret. See, Jessie had known Mahoret for her whole life, wrote deep, long letters to her, felt super close to Mahoret, who was one of the only people that Jessie could talk to about seeing spirits, and she comforted her when it became very scary. Mahoret helped her through her whole life, helped her go to school, gave her solace, helped connect her to family members in Italy, Ireland, England, and so forth, and eventually Jessie was invited to Mahoret's home for 2 weeks in the summer. Now, while Jessie is suspicious of Mahoret's boyfriend, friend, whatever, and Mahoret, for they are very pale, they never eat, seem to know what she's thinking, go to sleep all day, she always feels that something is up, but never questions it. Every time there's this inkling of suspicion, she finds her thoughts sort of change, or she doesn't think about it too hard. Yeah, she's manipulated into not remembering things, or just not noticing or thinking about things. And this includes not remembering finding the secret archive room where the majority of the Great Family Archive is kept. She remembers aspects of it. She begs Mahoret to let her work on it, as there are a lot of artifacts from places that no longer exist, and there's just this whole mystery and all kinds of things, and no family could possibly trace themselves so thoroughly through time. But Mahoret does not want her wasting her life doing something so fruitless, and tells her, maybe when you're older and you kind of know a little bit more about what you want, but for now you're so young, I don't want you wasting your life. Well, the Talamasca fills this gap for her. They make her feel welcome, they give her focus, and eventually she works her way through the ranks until she is studying vampires, which is one of the singular most dangerous things that you can do in the Talamasca. Yep, she approaches it with skepticism, which is kind of funny given all the things she had seen up to this point, but she eagerly takes up the hunt for Louis and Lestat, mainly for artifacts from their lives, including going to the home that they had shared with Claudia down in New Orleans. She outright buys out all of the people living there, and then proceeds to spend several nights there, peeling back wallpaper and finding a mural that Lestat had painted for Claudia, and finding a cubbyhole in Claudia's room where she stashed a sparsely used diary and a doll. And it gives great insight to Claudia's mindset of how she felt and what she thought, because you get the sense that this was written when she was older, but still trapped in a little kid's body, so it's quite fascinating, trust me. Now, one night, she accidentally oversleeps in the house overnight, which is a huge no-no. You see, there's a whole bunch of safety precautions when dealing with vampires, and if you break even one rule, you are off the case. So she's already supposed to be back in her hotel, which is actually in a different state, because it's a safety precaution. Well, she ends up experiencing a disconnected phone ringing in the hall, and she picks it up, and a female voice says her name. And even though she's dealt with a lot of stuff, including ghosts and shit, she panics. You know, this catches her so off guard, and she panics, and she drops the phone, and she runs out. Now, she starts getting sick, and she starts sweating, and she turns in for the night in her hotel room, and suddenly, she gets the sense she's being watched. And she lifts her head, and she finds this shape of a little girl just watching her, and all she feels is malice. And this makes her freak the fuck out, and she runs out of the room, and she starts crying, she's freaking out, she's having this massive panic attack in the hallway, scaring a shit ton of other people. Eventually, she's collected by a member of the Talamasca, and she goes back to the Talamasca home, and she recants the entire experiences to David Talbot, her 60 or so mentor, who tells her that she is being removed from the vampire case entirely, and that the diary will be taken care of. Down the road, the concert is happening, and Jessie needs to prove to herself that Lestat is real. She goes to the concert, she jumps onto the stage where she collides right into him, and they share a kiss. He's kissing her on the mouth and says into her mind directly something to the effect of, "Yeah, it's all real, Jessie, I'm real, it's all real." Okay, and then she is forced off the stage by a bouncer, and all Lestat says is, "Bye, Jessie." And she leaves the concert hall just high as hell off the knowledge that there is more to life, that she was right, that these men that she'd been researching are real, Lestat is real, and that's when a vampire she doesn't know picks her up and throws her across the room, smashing her skull, because he read her mind and found out that she was a Talamascan, which vampires do not like. They do not like being followed by the Talamasca. Majoret goes and collects her from the hospital and gives her a choice: to die or to be like her, which Jessie already had like an inclination of what Majoret was as the stuff with Stat was going down. So Jessie chooses to become a vampire because she just does not want to die. Now, through Jessie alone, we got a lot of stuff. She alone is the one who introduces us to the Talamasca, to David Talbot, who becomes an important character in later works, and to herself. And I just enjoy her segments of investigation, and her own retrospections, and her own life. Now there is also Daniel. He is another mortal turned into a vampire, but honestly his story is pretty dark and I fucking love it. Daniel Molly was a reporter and was the boy in Interview with the Vampire that interviewed Louis back in the day, and then ended up publishing a book anonymously. Then he starts seeking out Lestat, and he wants to be immortal. Despite everything that Louis said to him, he still wants to be immortal. But he ends up captured and stalked by Armand instead. If you don't remember Armand, he's featured in both the Interview with the Vampire and the Vampire Lestat. He used to be the Coven Master that ruled over the Théâtre des Vampires in Paris, a theater bought by Lestat and gifted to the Coven, the Paris Coven. And he eventually killed Lestat and Louis' child, Claudia, for several reasons, including revenge on Lestat, and to make room for himself to take over as Louis' companion. Now, Armand tells Daniel to run. Run as fast as you can, and they'll see whether or not Armand will kill him, or grow bored with him. And Daniel goes all over the world, and there are just times he'll go to a hotel and Armand is in the restaurant and has ordered everything off the menu because he's not sure what Daniel would want. Or Daniel will be walking through a crowd and will catch a glimpse of Armand across the street. Or he's sitting on a bus and he's minding his own business and just like reading the paper, and he'll like look at his neighbor and it's Armand. Okay, and this goes on for some time. I think accumulatively, the time that Daniel and Armand spend together is about 10 years. Now, at first, when all this starts, Daniel is just fucking scared. He's running, he's panicked, but soon, it just turns into a frustration, and he just grows very snarky and defiant. I mean, Armand is portrayed as a kind of dopey puppy, okay? He's confused, he's lost, but he's desperate for attention and love. For example, in one of the funny scenes in this book, Armand does not know how telephones work, and he just busts into Daniel's hotel room in the middle of the night and yells at him to show him how to call Paris on a phone. And Danny says, and I looked this quote up, "God damn it, do it yourself. You're 500 years old and you can't use a phone? Read the directions. What are you, an immortal idiot?" Not only does this show where their relationship is at, that Danny can snark him like that, but the fact that Armand hasn't killed him for it, you know, it shows quite a lot. From there, Armand grows incredibly passionate about learning everything he can, including technology, okay, especially technology. Cameras, blenders, microwaves, and even further still, he builds for himself and Danny Night Island. He accumulates vast fortunes from many different enterprises, like finding sunken treasure ships, and builds a leisure island with a grand villa for him and his beloved, you know, Danny, to live in, and they spend their time in. And they spend their time there and on many wonderful trips around the world. And all Danny can feel and dwell on is the fact that as much as Armand loves him, he will not make him into a vampire, and is willing to watch him grow old and die, insisting that it is a kinder fate to die than be an immortal, okay? And Armand even cries, like actual tears running down his face and everything, when confronted about this, saying that he only continues living because he's so damn scared to die, but at the same time he wouldn't want Daniel, never his precious Daniel, to become like him. And Danny's like, "You don't think I'm fucking scared to die? What the fuck, dude? You're really willing to just watch me wither and die, you fucking asshole? All this good stuff that we experience, I'll cease to experience any of it if I die." This gives insight into both Daniel and Armand, because Armand shows that he has levels of compassion and love that he couldn't always express, and that we didn't always get to see from the previous two books, where he was more villainous. And because we see how lost he actually really is in this work, he needs someone to latch onto and bring out the better aspects of his personality, but he is still very socially awkward, and it takes him a long time to grow with the times that he is in. And Daniel embodies the bitterness in a lot of us about mortality. He's bitter and he's angry. He loves and craves Armand as a person, yet at the same time is utterly repulsed by him. Danny, much to Armand's reluctance, does eventually get what he wants. He becomes a vampire. He would just drink himself into stupors, and he would run around the world without any money and be exposed to the elements and so forth, always telling himself he would not go back to Armand, and then he would beg to come back to Armand. And Armand would always go and get him, always welcome him with loving arms, and ask him what he could do to convince Daniel to just sit and stay with him. Well, one time Danny just overdoes it, okay? And he's just dying. He's not going to live through the night. He drank too much, and he was out in the cold, and he is just declining, and he's not going to live. And they're on their private jet, because Armand goes and finds him, collects him himself, puts him on a jet, and they are going to fly to Lestat's concert. Not necessarily, Armand's not willing to admit that he wants to see Lestat again. He says, like, it's clearly the only place that vampires are not being slaughtered is in California, near Lestat. So, he's holding Danny, and he gives him a choice. trying to impress upon him the significance of this choice. And Danny still insists that he wants it. And Armand is looking at this and he goes, I'm just too selfish to let you go. I am too selfish in my love for you. And I'm going to make you into a vampire. And Danny becomes Armand's very first fledgling ever. And it just fills me with so many feels. On one hand, this is a very predator-prey relationship. It's a vampire story. It's a horror story in a lot of respects. And on the other hand, it's this very twisted love story between an old and new character in this series, both of whom are fascinating in their own right. We gain perspective of Armand through someone else besides Louis and Lestat, who have negative histories with him. Well, negative/love, because despite all the shit that they've done, they still love him. Now, speaking of old characters, let's look at Lestat in this one. He is the main character, the main reason this story exists in the first place, so how is he handled in this book? Now, Lestat is meant to be, like, the hero. Now, he ultimately isn't the one to take out the bad guy. Hell, he actually almost wanted to save Akasha when he sees her dying. He has this generous nature and a sense of goodness and so forth, but he still fucks up, okay? He wants to be known, okay? One of the biggest things about his character is the idea of dying in obscurity. One of the biggest things that scares him, okay? This is something he can't cope with. He wants to break free. He wants to come out of the shadows, and what is the point of life if he can't share it with others? And considering by this point he's had a lot of failed relationships, or he was wandering alone, he's been alone for quite some time by that point, and he's always had this desire for purpose and attention and family. And if he could do that with a global audience, not to have to hide who he is and everything, so be it. He's gonna do that. Part of the reason for the concert was to draw others of his kind. Granted, he was spoiling for an ultimate fight between himself and them to go out in a blaze of glory, you know, fighting with those who disagreed with him. But he also wanted to be reunited with those he had loved, like Louis, Gabrielle, Marius, and so forth. And when Akasha comes, swoops in and kidnaps him, he does fall in love with her. Admittedly is seduced by her grand-scale plan to rid the earth of evil and rule over it, even if he doesn't agree with the methodology, and likes the utter abandonment of slaughter, all while hating it and trying to convince her to stop. After everything is over, Lestat and the rest of the vampires make a home in Armand's Night Island villa, and it is decided that they will all make sure to not just disappear or end it without first contacting at least somebody in the Coven. They are all that is left, and they want to be connected as they had never been before, when the vampire life was more crowded, there's like a lot more, and it's very territorial, or it's very lonely. And Lestat is actually happy with this, okay? He actually really likes this. There are new rules put into place, like no new vampires are to be made, no contact with mortals unless needed, always make sure there's a way for everyone to contact you. But Lestat, being the little fucker he is, he's not one for rules. He is still the Brat Prince. Despite his depression and grief after what had happened to Akasha, because, you know, despite everything, despite her naivete and thinking that you take out, like, one aspect of the populace, everything's gonna be just fine, Lestat still loved her, did still fall in love with her, and despite these new rules that have been put into place, partially because of his fuckery, Lestat still fully intends to publish The Queen of the Damned, and despite Louis' very specific, deep protests, visits David Talbot of the Telemasca. He tells him that Justy is dead, so he won't go looking for her, and he gives him a number that if David ever gets the urge to use it, Lestat will come. He's to use it when he wants to become immortal. Now, David insists, with no hesitation, that he does not want such a thing. He does not want to be immortal. Lestat does not believe him, and basically says when eventually he can't cope with the idea of turning into nothingness, give him a call. He can't promise that he'll turn him into a vampire, but he will come and visit you. This naturally shakes David, and Lestat flees out of the second-story window, Louis in his arms, laughing. He's just laughing with dark glee at the mischief he's caused, all while Louis chastises him, which makes him laugh even harder. So in this book, we see the same drives that Lestat has always had. He is still the villain that we root for. I still maintain he's pretty much like a likable villain. Okay, he still has grief and love in him. He still has perseverance to keep on with life, despite all of the complex emotion he feels and the dire situations that he finds himself in. It's a good expansion of what was already established. Oh, side note, because it's pretty important to Lestat's character in terms of his morality. There is also Marius, who comes back in for a good chunk of this, acting as a mentor, as well as a pleader for humanity and goodness, keeping vampires and humans separate, and willing to kill the queen, even if it means the end of all vampires, because of how fucking bitter and pissed off he is. He has that same strong, benevolent air he had when he was interacting and educating Lestat back in the Vampire Lestat, and is partially credited with giving Lestat his viewpoints of protecting humanity once the shit hit the fan, and trying to reason with Akasha, who claims Lestat sounds like Marius. Marius, keep in mind, has also spent thousands of years of his existence being the king and queen's caretaker, and when Akasha rises up, she buries Marius in this horrible, bloody, painful fucking snowy pit inside of a mountain where he is trapped, but yet cannot fucking die. And it takes a rescue effort to get him out. And he has spent so many years taking care of her and talking to her, all while waiting for the day that she would eventually rise. And he's just given fuck all for it, and it pisses him off. It really pisses him off, and I love that characterization of him. Alright, so as I've said, for this book, in general, it is a lot of information. I mean, I didn't even go over Baby Jenks, I didn't go over every symbolic moment, every character, every single plot-driven thing, but it is a lot, and it is pretty well written. It builds off of each chapter very well. It blends multiple storylines pretty well, without being utterly jarring when it switches perspective or it switches to a different character. Each thing encapsulates into its own story before moving on to the next one. It doesn't, like, just leave you on a complete and utter cliffhanger. No, it blends it very well. Each section and chapter is tied to another in some way, shape, or form, even if it's just characterization versus plot-driven stuff. And for me personally, I really liked a lot of the additions of new characters, especially Daniel and Jesse. We don't necessarily need human characters to work our way into the vampire narrative. I mean, most of the stories are told just solely from a vampire perspective. But Jesse and Daniel are very interesting characters who take completely different viewpoints and things. Jesse is this really well-adjusted person who copes very well with the idea of vampires and mortality and things like that, versus Daniel, who fucking just poor Daniel. As the first, like, arguably proper sequel in the Vampire Chronicles, I feel like it was built off very well of the previous two stories. So Lestat's being intermingled with the others honestly was a very wise move, okay? Because if they hadn't done that, I feel like the book would be much, much shorter if you just have Lestat's parts. But this helped give it a lot of scope. Other things are going on, and we learn a lot more, and we can think a lot more when we're seeing it from different viewpoints. And each character feels like their own character. They have similarities being what they are in some of their viewpoints, but you can see very clearly each of these characters has their own voice and own history, and I really, really appreciated that. And a lot of the stuff that is in this book helps directly affect what happens in later books. So that is also really good. In general, I do think that while this book can occasionally drag on a little bit and be a little repetitious here and there, I do think that it's a pretty well-written, fantastic, mythologically based ride. It's not perfect. sometimes the story of the twins can take on a little too long, or certain things are brought up multiple times, and it's like, yes, I get it, come on. But I honestly recommend it. I honestly, full-heartedly think that if you're a Vampire Chronicles fan, especially, you're going to get more of a kick out of this book. And yeah, in any case, thank you for watching. Terry over and out.